By the time the elevator doors opened, my badge was dead. The red light blinked and the security guard stared at the floor. Nobody said "you're fired" loud. They just walked me out like I was a mess they couldn't risk leaving inside. My name is Bram Crane. I was 56 years old. I lived in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'd given a little over 21 years to Keene Meridian Clinics. It was Tuesday afternoon, just over a day after that walkout, and they were already treating my termination like a live wire. My phone was quiet, but my inbox wasn't. Access updated. Folder ownership changed. Calendar permissions removed. A vendor rep asked who signed off now. Even Dana at the front desk texted, "Are you okay?" Like the wrong reply could hurt her. People always called me compliance, like I walked around saying no. Truth was, I kept the rails straight. I built the board calendars, the signature chains, the credentialing packets, the incident logs, the vendor contracts. I made sure we could prove what we did when the state showed up with clipboards and bad attitudes. Quick note, before listening, share which city or country you're watching from. And let's continue. Our headquarters wasn't some glass tower. It was bolted to the flagship clinic. White corridors, badge readers, cameras that never blinked. In that place, access wasn't a convenience. It was evidence, and they'd just erased mine. Orson Keene built the company the hard way. He didn't raise his voice, but you listened anyway. He used to tap a binder and say, "If you can't show it on paper, it didn't happen." I'd watched grown surgeons shut up when he said that. Orson kept a small circle. I wasn't loud, but he trusted me to keep the rails straight when everyone else chased growth. Back when we only had 2 clinics, I drafted policies with him at his kitchen table. Outside work, my life was simple. Divorced. 1 kid at home. My son finishing high school, watching me like he expected me to fold. Monday night, he said, "Did they really push you out?" I told him, "They tried," and I started washing dishes. The year Orson started getting sick, I didn't panic. I got quieter. I tightened procedures. I updated binders. I made sure old files didn't disappear during some convenient cleanup. You do that when you feel weather coming. I wasn't worried about Orson stepping back. I was worried about who would step forward. Boards get nervous around illness, and nervous boards grab the first simple answer. Lately, meeting invites came from Keene Family Office, not Orson's assistant. Looking back, the crack showed early. Meetings got shorter, decisions got lighter. People stopped asking, "Is this allowed?" and started asking, "Can we just do it?" Tuesday afternoon, I dragged my old governance binder onto the kitchen table and flipped it open. The first tab I flipped to was the old governance section, the kind Orson insisted we print even when everyone else wanted everything digital. The paper smelled like dust and toner, and the margins still had my handwriting from back when decisions were slower, and people respected that slow could mean safe. Orson was in his 70s then, and his decline didn't hit like a car crash. It crept in like a leak behind a wall, quiet until it wasn't. After a bad stretch of hospital stays, the board started acting like a crisis without ever saying the word out loud. And that's how you knew they were scared. The next thing I knew, they were installing his nephew, Tobin Keene, as interim CEO. Like blood made you competent, and a last name counted as a resume. I met Tobin the same week the title changed. He was 36, polished and confident in that cheap way only an untested man could be. He had a bright smile that said he already pictured himself on a magazine cover, and his eyes never really landed on me because he was always scanning the room for who mattered more. When he shook my hand, he said, "Bram, I've heard you keep the wheels turning," like I was a maintenance guy for a machine he'd inherited. His first company-wide meeting wasn't in the clinic auditorium, where you looked staff in the face and took real questions. He filmed it like a show, standing in front of a branded backdrop with perfect lighting, then posted clips to the internal portal like we were followers, not employees. He kept saying words like momentum and reinvention, and people clapped because clapping is safer than thinking. I watched the video once, then saved a copy, because anything that public in a company that regulated was never just a message. When Tobin finally pulled me into his office, he didn't ask a single real question about licensing, accreditation, or incident response. He leaned back like he was relaxing, then said, "Can we simplify some protocols so managers can move faster, because speed is the whole game now?" I kept my voice even and said, "In healthcare, speed without process turns into state action. and state action turns into closures. He smiled wider like I'd told a cute joke and replied, I hear you, but we can't keep living in the past. Within 2 weeks, he brought in 2 friends as advisors, like the clinic network was a college group project. Kip Marlowe ran morale events and acted like enthusiasm could replace training, and Perrin Locke called himself strategy while mostly talking in slogans and drawing org charts that made grown professionals look like chess pieces. Tobin started swapping out experienced directors for loyal faces, and people who knew state regs got pushed aside for people who knew Tobin's college stories. Clinic leads noticed right away, but nobody wanted to be the first one labeled negative, because that label could end your career faster than a mistake. My access started changing in quiet ways that were never officially announced. A shared folder would move, a calendar permission would accidentally reset, and a board packet would get sent without my review, which used to be unheard of. They weren't cutting me in half, they were shaving me down, one permission at a time, like they wanted me smaller before they made me disappear. Celeste Van, our HR director, began dodging my eyes in the hallway. She was always professional, but now she moved like someone living with a secret she didn't choose, and she kept her hands tight around her tablet like it was a shield. One afternoon, Tobin stopped by my area and right in front of my team, laughed and called the old governance system museum stuff, then watched faces for reactions like a kid testing a bruise. I didn't confront him, not once, because men like that fed on conflict, so I turned back to my binder, opened a fresh note page, and started logging every change with dates and names. I kept that fresh note page open and wrote until the pen started to drag, because the only thing I could control was the record. When you'd been somewhere a long time, you could feel a firing coming before it arrived, and it never felt mystical. It felt like logistics closing around you, quiet and cold, while everyone smiled like nothing was wrong. The first squeeze was simple. Meetings that used to have my name on them stopped appearing, and approvals I'd handled for years got rerouted to executive review. Managers started telling me, they said to run it by someone else first, and nobody would say who that someone was. Nobody announced the change because the whole point was to make it look natural. Then Tobin started hosting early leadership huddles in a glass room off the main corridor, and somehow I was never included, even when half the agenda was credentialing and compliance. I asked a director why I wasn't on the invite, and she said, he wants fewer voices so we can move faster, before she hurried off. That wasn't an oversight, and it wasn't an accident, because plans like that never are. Nadine Rowe pulled me aside by the supply closet and said, he asked me if we can cut onboarding from 6 weeks to 8 days, and he acted like it was normal. She looked sick saying it, and I didn't sugarcoat my answer. I told her, that is how you build a disaster and pretend you didn't, and she nodded once, tight-jawed. That was when I started my own quiet work, the same way Orson trained me to handle storms. I pulled old agreements Orson and I drafted in the early years, the ones nobody opened unless lawyers were already in the building. I checked signatures and dates, and I made copies that did not depend on company folders moving overnight. I reached back out to my outside attorney, Tessa Brenner, with a clean message that didn't sound like panic. I wrote, I want to be ready if I get shoved out wrong, and I want to do it the right way. She replied with 2 lines. Keep your timeline. Keep your documents. I saved it in a folder I never used for anything else. After that, I started logging every HR interaction to a private email thread, with nothing but facts. Dates, subject lines, who spoke, and what they asked me to do, with 0 opinion on top. Calm writing lasted longer than angry writing, and I stayed calm on purpose. The timing made it worse because the company was in the middle of a sensitive investment deal with a conservative healthcare fund. I wasn't in the sales pitch, but I handled the back end, board approvals, risk disclosures, and the legal steps that kept investors from bolting. Tobin didn't respect that and pushed a rebrand anyway, with a new tagline and more leadership videos, even though state inspectors were scheduled for the quarter. He kept talking about energy, while the clinics needed stability and predictability, and that disconnect made my stomach stay tight all day. At home, my son heard me on the phone late at night and stood in my doorway in socks. He asked, "Are you sure everything is okay? Because you sound like you are fighting without yelling." I told him, "It is fine and I am handling it." Then I closed my laptop and went back to the kitchen. I still went in every day and did the work, but I also pulled one specific document from the archives. An old operational return provision Orson insisted on years ago. It wasn't a threat and it wasn't revenge. It was a seatbelt for a company that liked to speed. I verified the pages, clipped my notes behind it, and locked it in my bottom drawer. When I slid the drawer shut, the metal clicked like a warning shot, and I left my hand on it a second longer than normal. I grabbed my coat, nodded at my team like nothing was wrong, and walked out into the corridor with my face set. The firing came on a Monday, because they loved to blow things up before the week even got going. I got the meeting invite at 6:43 in the morning while I was still in my truck in the parking deck, watching the clinic lights blink on floor by floor. My phone buzzed against the console, sharp and impatient, and I already knew it wasn't a real check-in. The subject line said, "Quick check-in," with no agenda, no prep, just a room number like a trap laid out in plain view. I sat there with the engine off, staring at the calendar ping, and I felt my stomach tighten without my hands shaking. I didn't call anybody and I didn't text Nadine, because panic spread faster than facts and Tobin loved watching people scramble. I opened my notes app, typed the time, the subject line, and the room number, then tucked my phone in my shirt pocket. After that, I got out of the truck and walked in. When I stepped into the HR conference room, Tobin was already seated like he owned the air. Jacket perfect and smile switched on. Celeste sat beside him, stiff with her hands folded, eyes fixed past my shoulder like she couldn't risk looking at me, and her knuckles looked pale from the pressure. The room smelled like burnt coffee and that lemon cleaner they used when they wanted a place to feel fresh. The blinds threw hard stripes of light across the table. Tobin started talking before I even sat, using that friendly voice people used when they wanted you to swallow something bitter. He hit the script. Organizational alignment, new direction, role redundancy, and then took his shot, calling my approach old school and slow, like slow was a flaw instead of the thing that kept patients out of headlines. He kept his voice light, like he was doing me a favor, and that fake kindness made my jaw tighten harder than any insult. Celeste slid the paperwork toward me with both hands, and I noticed the date field wasn't filled in yet. That blank space lodged in my head because nobody forgot dates in a termination packet unless they planned to use the date like a weapon later. I didn't argue or beg, and I didn't give Tobin the show he wanted because he was the type who fed on noise and called it leadership. I asked one question, calm enough to sound routine. "Is the board aware of this action?" Tobin smirked and said, "The board wants modernization," and he still didn't answer me. I turned to Celeste and said, "I understand you have a process to follow, and I expect you to follow it." And she flinched and kept her eyes down like she was trying to disappear in her own chair. Tobin leaned forward and called me a bottleneck, laughing like it was a joke between friends. He said the company was moving into the future, and he watched my face like he could force a reaction out of me if he stared long enough. When I said my attorney would handle the rest, Tobin's smile tightened and he said, "You do not need to make this ugly, Bram." I answered, "I am not making anything ugly. I am keeping it clean." I didn't sign anything. I only acknowledged I'd received notice, and his smile twitched like my calm was disrespect. The walkout was worse than the meeting because the hallway was busy and suddenly quiet, and people looked away like eye contact could get them punished next. One supervisor turned his body toward the wall to avoid me, and that was enough. I kept moving because stopping would have turned it into a scene, and Tobin would have loved that. I got to my truck, shut the door, put both hands on the steering wheel, breathed slow, and then I opened my banking app and checked the final payroll deposit they'd rushed through. The deposit went through, and I took a screenshot before the app could time out. Then I started the truck and rolled out of the deck, because I wasn't giving them the satisfaction of watching me sit there. I drove straight to a small notary office near the courthouse, an old place with worn carpet and a glass window that had seen every kind of human mess. The air smelled like paper, coffee, and cheap cleaner, and the clerk didn't look up until I said I needed something notarized right now. I'd printed my letter the night before and kept it sealed until the notary called me back. She didn't read every page, but she read enough to raise her eyebrows and say, "This is serious, so you sign where I point and you do not rush me." I answered, "Take your time, just make the stamp clean." And I watched her do it. Signature, stamp, time recorded. Like the world still had rules that mattered. Next stop was a courier desk a few blocks away, the kind wedged between a tax office and a bail bonds place. I told the clerk, I need legal courier service with tracking and a signature requirement. And he slid a form across the counter. I tapped the recipient line and said, delivery must be signed by Willa Hallworth, General Counsel, and nobody else gets to accept it. Sitting in my truck afterward, I messaged my attorney, Tessa Brenner, and kept it short because feelings weren't evidence. Termination today. Notarized notice going out. Clock starts on counsel's signature, I wrote. She replied fast. Good. Do not talk to anyone. Let them talk to you. And I put the phone face down like it might start a fire. The clause I triggered wasn't a magic trick, and it wasn't me throwing a tantrum. It was an old operational return provision Orson insisted on back when we were small and hungry, the kind of seatbelt people laughed at until the crash. If a defined key control officer was terminated without proper board procedure, and the severance conditions in the charter, a 72-hour clock started. During that window, operational authority kicked back into the founder's trust, and the name's successor. So reckless leadership couldn't sprint the company into a license violation. I didn't announce it, and I didn't warn anyone, because drama was for people who needed witnesses. I let the document land where it belonged, on the general counsel's desk. With proof it arrived and no room for the classic lie, we never received it. Around 12:18 in the afternoon, the courier tracker updated. Signed by Willa Hallworth. I saved the confirmation, forwarded it to Tessa, and kept my hands steady. Later that afternoon, my phone lit up with texts I didn't answer, and I let each one die on the screen. Former coworkers asked if I was okay. A clinic director asked what Tobin said, and Nadine wrote, "Please tell me you have a plan because he is cutting corners." I didn't ignore them out of spite. I ignored them because every extra word could be twisted and used against somebody. That night, at home, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote my timeline in block letters. I listed the time of the firing, the time of the deposit, the notary stamp, the courier dispatch, and the delivery signature, one clean line after another. When I finished, I drew a hard line under the last entry and capped my pen. I left the legal pad right where it was and washed the coffee mug like I hadn't just set a fuse under their feet. My house was quiet except for the fridge humming, and that kind of quiet could make you say something stupid if you let it. I didn't let it, and I kept my phone face down until it buzzed hard enough to make the table rattle. The first leak came from Hollis Dane, a risk control coordinator I'd mentored for years. Hollis never played hero, and he didn't call himself a whistleblower, because he hated drama almost as much as I did. He just hated watching bad decisions get papered over like nothing happened. His text came in blunt and shaky at the same time. "They're scrambling. It's real." I stared at it for 1 second, then I typed back, "Do not put yourself in danger, and only send what already exists." He answered, "I am being careful, but they are losing it." And then the screenshots started. The first screenshot was an internal Teams thread with Tobin in all caps. "Who authorized this clause?" Like the clause needed permission from his ego. Somebody replied underneath, calmer than him, that it was reaffirmed during a prior compliance cycle, which was the kind of line that sounded harmless until you remembered how many people signed off on those cycles. Another screenshot showed Perrin Locke, Tobin's loud strategy friend, suddenly turning quiet in the chat. It wasn't because Perrin grew morals overnight, and it wasn't because he found a conscience in a conference room. It was because he could smell consequences. And I realized right then he might become useful without ever being trustworthy. Celeste made her first move to save herself before the sun even came up the next day. Hollis forwarded a draft termination document that showed a different effective date than the morning I was fired, and my throat went tight in that angry, controlled way. They were trying to backdate or redate the event to bend the clock, and it was sloppy enough to insult me. They didn't know I already had a clean chain of timestamps sitting in my house like a loaded toolkit. The bank deposit, the notary stamp, the courier dispatch, the delivery signature, and my attorney's receipt. If they changed dates, they weren't fixing a problem. They were creating a new one. I forwarded the screenshot to Tessa with one line. "They are playing with the effective date." She replied fast, "Excellent, let them keep digging," and I could almost hear her tone through the screen. That was the ugly truth about cover-ups, and I'd seen it 100 times in incident reviews. When people tried to hide the first mistake, they left more fingerprints than the original act ever had. Later that afternoon, I got my first direct update from Willa Hallworth, the general counsel, and it wasn't emotional or friendly. She called and said, "Payroll flagged it. The freeze hit the top floor first." Then she paused like she was letting that sink in on purpose. I asked, "What freeze are we talking about?" And she answered, "The trust provision that stops executive bonuses during an operational return review." I didn't laugh because it wasn't funny, but it explained the pitch of the panic in a way nothing else could. The loudest fear in that building wasn't about leadership or patience. It was about money. That night, Nadine called my personal phone, and her voice sounded tight but controlled, like she was trying not to crack. She said, "Tobin is pushing clinics to relax reporting steps because we do not need to scare regulators with paperwork." And I felt heat rise in my face because that sentence alone could sink a license. I kept my voice low and said, "Do not sign anything you do not understand, and keep copies of what you are asked to do." Nadine breathed out hard and said, "I needed to hear that from someone sane." And I told her, "Protect yourself first, because people like him sacrifice someone else first." By the end of the day, Tobin's team had fired or sidelined 2 more veterans, thinking fear would choke the leaks. It did the opposite, because people didn't get loyal when you threatened them. They got careful, and careful people kept records. I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Evidence, dropped Hollis's screenshots inside, and hit print on the draft with the changed date. The printer finished spitting the last page, and I stacked the warm paper into a neat pile like I was filing a routine incident report. My phone buzzed again before I could even slide it into the folder, and I already knew I wasn't getting invited to anything official. Tobin had control of security access now, which meant I wasn't allowed near the board floor, and that wasn't about safety. That was about keeping me out of sight while they tried to rewrite the story. So everything I learned about the board meeting came through 2 channels, and I treated both like evidence. Willa Hallworth gave me a formal recap later, clean and lawyer-tight, while Hollis Dane fed me a time-stamped blow-by-blow by text from inside the building. I didn't ask Hollis to play hero, and I didn't push him for more than he could safely share. I just let him send what he sent, and I saved every message like it might have to speak for itself. Hollis's first text came in quick. He is up there smiling like this is a show. Then another. Willa just walked in with folders. According to Willa, Tobin opened the meeting like he was hosting a podcast, standing instead of sitting, grinning like cameras were rolling. He talked about speed and fresh culture, and he kept calling experienced clinic directors legacy drag, like the people who kept the lights on were a stain on his brand. Hollis typed, "He is doing the hand gestures," and I could picture it perfectly, the same performance he'd done in those glossy internal videos. Then Willa cut in, and she didn't do it emotionally or loudly. She did it like a scalpel, calm and exact, because that was how she won rooms full of powerful people. She said a notarized execution notice had been delivered, and that it referenced an active operational return clause tied to my termination. Hollis texted, "Tobin laughed like he can charm paper." And a second later, he sent a screenshot of Tobin's own message fired off mid-meeting. "Lisa, sorry, Willa, tell them this is nothing." Under pressure, Tobin couldn't even keep names straight, and that told me more than any insult ever could. Willa told me the board chair, Maris Caldwell, didn't react with a speech or a threat. She asked one question that mattered, and she asked it like she expected a real answer. Was the termination approved by the board in the manner required under the charter? Tobin apparently talked around it, the way people do when the truth is a cliff edge. Hollis's next text said, "Room went quiet," and I believed him because silence was what happened when people realized the risk wasn't theoretical anymore. Willa requested a recess to confirm enforceability, and she didn't ask permission like she was Tobin's employee. She said she needed time to verify, and she left with physical folders, the kind people pretended didn't exist until they needed them to save themselves. Hollis texted, "She just walked out with binders like it is 2005. And I almost smiled because Orson would have approved of that. During the recess, Tobin reportedly snapped at Celeste in the hallway, demanding she fix the date issue, like a messed-up date was a stain you could scrub off. When I saw Celeste later on a forwarded hallway camera still, her face looked tight and hollow, like somebody who realized too late she bet on the wrong horse. When the meeting reconvened, Willa laid it out plain, with no drama to hide behind. Clause valid. Reaffirmed years ago. Severance and notice requirements not met. Board procedure bypassed. Clock already running. One independent director, Grant Sutter, spoke up, and Willa later told me his voice was the only one with any heat in it. He said, "This isn't a technicality, this is a governance fail." and nobody challenged him because they couldn't. Tobin tried to throw around litigation and emergency injunctions like buzzwords could scare ink off a page. Willa shut it down the way she shut everything down, by pointing at what was signed and what it meant. She made it clear the clause stripped Tobin's authority under the trigger condition, and the trust held control during the window, whether Tobin liked it or not. The final detail Willa told me made me pause with my hand on the folder tab, because it showed how desperate he got when his confidence stopped working. Tobin tried to go see Orson for a last-minute override, and security at the care facility wouldn't even let him through the hallway because he wasn't authorized for trust matters. So I clipped Hollis's screenshots to my printed stack and sealed the whole packet into my evidence folder. I sealed the evidence folder and set it on the corner of the table like it weighed something because it did. My hands didn't shake, but my jaw stayed tight, and I kept listening for my phone to light up again. When it finally did, it wasn't Tobin, and that alone told me the next move wasn't coming from ego. It was coming from paper. The next board session happened early the following day, and I wasn't there. I learned it through Willa's post-meeting call and a copy of the board agenda Hollis forwarded after the fact, both time-stamped and matching down to the order of items. That match mattered because when two sources lined up, you didn't have to guess who was spinning. Willa's voice on the phone was flat and professional, and she said, "I'm going to tell you what occurred, and I need you to listen without interrupting." I told her, "I am listening, and I'm taking notes," and I picked up my pen. Maris Caldwell asked Willa to confirm the last missing piece, the identity of the successor named in Orson's trust for an operational return event. The board could argue process all day, but the trust name was the hammer, and everybody in that room knew it. Willa brought a sealed envelope held in trust custody, placed there years earlier, witnessed, notarized, and documented like it was meant for a day nobody wanted to see. She said it wasn't dramatic, just official, the kind of thing you hoped would collect dust forever. Hollis texted from inside. They brought in an envelope like a courthouse prop, and Tobin started smirking. Tobin mocked it, because that was his only setting when consequences showed up. Hollis wrote, "He said it was like a game show, and he looked around for laughs," and that line made my teeth grind. That was how you could tell a man had never carried real weight, because he joked when the room was drowning. Willa didn't react to him, and she didn't argue, because arguing with a performer just gave him more stage. Willa opened the envelope carefully, like one tear in the paper could turn into a future argument. Maris read first, then passed it around the table. No big speech, no lecturing, just paper moving hand to hand like evidence being entered. Willa told me Grant Sutter described the silence afterward as something he hadn't heard in years, the kind of quiet that meant people were doing math in their heads. Tobin demanded somebody say it out loud, because he couldn't stand letting the room hold it without his permission. Willa finally did, and she said my name, Bram Crane, as the appointed successor for operational oversight in the trust directive. Hollis texted me right after. His face went pale, then red, then blank, and he just sat there. Not anger first, just confusion. Like he couldn't accept the quiet guy could be written into something permanent. Willa added one detail that mattered more than his reaction, and she said it like she was underlining it for the record. "The trust language isn't vague, Bram. It names you as the designated continuity officer and authorized contact for Orson on governance matters." That meant Tobin couldn't claim ignorance, couldn't pretend it was unclear, and couldn't wiggle into the gap with a smile. His next move was predictable, and it started within minutes. My phone began ringing over and over, and the first voicemail sounded like a sales pitch, all friendly words and fake respect. The next one turned into bargaining, and then the edge came out, sharp and personal, like he thought anger could bully ink off a page. I didn't listen to most of them, because I didn't need his performance in my head, but I saved every message and backed them up. Perrin Locke tried his own little rescue plan, because desperate men always start trading other people's careers like poker chips. Hollis forwarded me Perrin's message to a board contact. "Keep Tobin, keep me, and push Bram into an advisory role so we can move forward." Perrin wasn't smart, but he was desperate, and desperation leaked everywhere. I created a folder labeled voicemails, dropped the files in, and set my phone face down on the nightstand before I turned off the light. I woke up to my phone vibrating on the nightstand like it was trying to crawl away. The screen lit up with Tobin's name again, and I let it ring until it quit, because I wasn't giving him anything he could twist into a story. The day before the clock expired, he called me 9 times between breakfast and mid-afternoon, like persistence could rewrite a trust directive. The first message he left sounded polished and respectful on the surface, like he was trying to sell me reason as a favor. He said, "Bram, let's be reasonable, because we can handle this like professionals." Like he hadn't tried to erase me with a blank date field. By the last one, his tone had collapsed into something ugly and thin, and he sounded like a man begging not to be embarrassed in front of people who finally stopped clapping for him. I didn't respond, because silence stayed clean when everything else got dirty. Words could be twisted, and Tobin lived for twisting, so I kept my mouth shut and my records tight. Willa was the only person I spoke to directly, and even that was short enough to fit on a sticky note. She called mid-morning and didn't waste time on greetings. She asked, "Will you confirm you activated the clause?" And I said, "Yes, I activated it and I have the delivery confirmation saved." She replied, "That is all I needed." And the line went dead like a door closing. While that happened, the company's internal world started cracking in ways you could see from the outside if you knew where to look. Hala sent screenshots of clinic managers asking if state inspections were still on schedule and whether leadership changes had to be disclosed. In healthcare, uncertainty spread like a rash, and the people on the ground didn't care about Tobin's slogans. They cared about licenses and patient charts, and whether the next inspector walked in already suspicious. Nadine texted me, then called when I didn't answer, and I picked up because she was exposed too and I wasn't going to ignore her. She told me Tobin's vibes guy, Kip, tried to push a staff video about positive mindset during change, complete with a grin and upbeat music. Nadine's voice went hard when she said, "It landed like a joke at a funeral, because nobody wants a pep talk when their license is on the line." And I told her, "Keep your head down and keep copies because this place is turning into a liability trap." Willa updated me again later, and this time she let a little irritation slip through her calm. She said the bonus freeze was now the loudest pressure point, and executives who didn't care about governance suddenly cared deeply about governance. I answered, "Funny how integrity shows up the moment money gets touched." And Willa said, "It is not funny, but yes, it is predictable," before she moved on. Tobin tried to weaponize Celeste, and that part didn't surprise me at all. He had HR draft a statement saying I'd been terminated for performance, like slapping a label on me would cover the procedural hole. Celeste hesitated, and Perrin, scrambling to save his own neck, warned someone in legal that falsifying cause could backfire, which told me even the loud idiot could smell smoke. Willa shut the statement down and told the board it would increase liability and make the trust's case cleaner. And she said it like weather, not pride. Late afternoon, Grant Sutter called my personal phone, and his voice sounded like a man who'd watched companies burn before. He said, "If you take the chair, you better stabilize the clinics fast, because this isn't about winning, it's about the patients." And I told him, "I agree, and I am ready to be boring on purpose." He didn't praise that, but he didn't argue either, and the call ended like a handshake. That evening, Willa told me Orson had been informed again, not to ask permission, just to confirm awareness. She said Orson smiled when she said my name, then closed his eyes and rested like the decision had been finished in his mind long before Tobin ever strutted into that job. I sat at my kitchen table and prepared my return packet quietly. Continuity memo, reassurance notes for clinic leadership, and a clean list of immediate reversals. Then I dragged Tobin's voicemails into a folder for Tessa and hit send. After I hit send, I shut the laptop and left the return packet stacked by the door. Thursday morning I arrived early, but I didn't walk in like a man coming back to beg for his job. I walked in like a man answering a legal handoff, because that was what it was. At the badge reader, the light turned green on the first swipe. The lock clicked and the guard gave me a stiff nod that said he'd already been briefed. Security had reactivated my access on counsel's order, not Tobin's. Willa met me outside the boardroom and said, "Keep your phone off and your voice low." I told her, "I'm here to stabilize, not put on a show," and she opened the door. Tobin stood off to the side, trying to look bored, but his jaw kept working like he was grinding his teeth. He looked like he'd just learned the building ran on structure, not confidence. Maris Caldwell read the motion aloud and asked for hands. Every hand went up, and it happened without speeches, just procedure, quiet and final. It was unanimous, and nobody even hesitated. After the vote, Willa handed me the signed governance entry, clean and recorded with the time on it, and she said, "There's no room for misunderstanding now." She also said legal concurrence was entered, plain and complete. I slid it into my folder and didn't look at Tobin when he shifted. Then Willa slid a thin stack of papers toward him and said, "This is your separation package, board approved and timed to avoid further risk." Tobin's face tightened, and he tried one last time to talk over the room. He said, "This company is my family's, and you're treating me like I don't belong here." Grant Sutter cut him off without raising his voice. "Blood doesn't outrank the charter, and you just learned that," he said. When I spoke, I kept my voice low and plain. "My first priority is stability. Clinic compliance, staff confidence, and keeping regulators satisfied," I said. And Maris nodded like she'd been waiting for that sentence. Then I looked at Willa and said, "Formally note the attempted backdating of my termination in the legal file, and notify Tobin that any further document manipulation will be treated as a serious breach." Tobin didn't flinch, but his jaw locked. Afterward, I found Nadine in the hallway and told her, "You're safe, and your people are safe." Her shoulders dropped and she hurried off before her eyes got wet. Hollis didn't come closer. He just nodded from a distance and I nodded back. Tobin left with a box and a forced smile. No shouting and no escort scene. Just a signature and a door closing. That night I drove home and my son asked, "So what happened today?" I told him, "I did it the right way, and I documented." He nodded and looked down. Then I set my keys on the counter and pulled out my folder. Quick gut check before you click away. What would you do in my place? If you've got the hype button, tap it to support this video and help it reach more people. Then please subscribe and hit like because it's huge for us and it's one click. Drop a comment. Good story works, but tell me this. When someone tries to erase you, do you confront them loud, or do you stay quiet and let the record speak for you?